The blood-streaked moon hung low over the Dakota Territory as Theresa Gallagher staggered through the tall prairie grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her once fine dress now torn and stained with the evidence of her desperate flight. Behind her, the silhouette of Holloway Manor stood like a sentinel against the night sky, its windows glowing with an eerie light that seemed to follow her even as she put distance between herself and that house of horrors. It was 1876, a year that promised so much for the expanding nation but had delivered only misery for Theresa. 8 months earlier, she had arrived at Holloway Manor as the new bride of Frederick Holloway, a man whose wealth was matched only by the darkness that lurked beneath his gentlemanly facade. The bruises that now dotted her arms and face were testament to the true nature of the man she had been forced to marry. The night air bit at her skin, the early October chills seeping through her thin clothing. Theresa pushed on, her thoughts a jumble of fear and determination. She had waited until Frederick had passed out from drink before making her escape, taking nothing but the locket that contained a small portrait of her deceased parents. Now, with nothing but moonlight to guide her way, she headed west, toward the small settlement of Pine Ridge that lay some 15 miles from the manor. Her legs gave out just as the first fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky. Collapsing into a heap at the edge of a small creek, Theresa allowed herself a moment of despair. She had no money, no food, and nowhere to go. Frederick would surely come looking for her. A man like him could not abide the shame of a runaway wife. If she was caught, the punishment would be severe, perhaps fatal. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent a spike of terror through her. Scrambling to her feet, Theresa looked frantically for a place to hide, but the open prairie offered little shelter. The rider appeared on the ridge above her, his silhouette outlined against the dawn sky. Theresa froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Madam." The voice was deep, cautious, nothing like Frederick's cultured tone. "You all right down there?" Theresa remained silent, poised to flee if necessary. The rider dismounted and led his horse down the gentle slope toward her. As he drew closer, she could see that he was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, dressed in the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn denim, a faded shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. "Don't mean to frighten you," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "But you look like you could use some help." "I'm fine," Theresa managed, her voice barely audible. "Just resting." The man's eyes, a clear blue in the growing light, took in her appearance, the torn dress, the bruises, the wild fear in her eyes. His expression softened with understanding. "Name's Matthew Dawson," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "I run cattle about 5 miles west of here. Got a small place. Nothing fancy, but there's coffee brewing and a fire going." Theresa took a step back, suspicion clouding her features. Matthew sighed and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a worn wool blanket. He shook it out and offered it to her without approaching any closer. "Look, I don't know what you're running from, but I can see you're in trouble. I'm offering you a blanket and a place to rest, nothing more. You can be on your way once you're warmed up and had something to eat." Theresa hesitated, then reached out with trembling fingers to take the blanket. It smelled of horses and leather, but it was clean and warm. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the simple comfort of it nearly bringing her to tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome to ride with me," Matthew said, gesturing to his horse. "Or I can walk alongside if you prefer." Theresa studied him, searching for any sign of deception or malice. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I can walk." Matthew smiled, a gentle expression that reached his eyes. "My place isn't far. Follow me." True to his word, Matthew's homestead was modest, a sturdy log cabin with a small barn and corral. A tendril of smoke rose from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. As they approached, a dog bounded out to greet them, a friendly mutt with one ear standing upright and the other flopped over. "That's Buck," Matthew said as the dog danced around their feet. "He's all bark and no bite." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A pot of coffee simmered on the iron stove, and the single room was divided by function rather than walls, a kitchen area with a rough-hewn table, a living space with 2 chairs before the hearth, and a bed tucked into the far corner, separated by a patchwork curtain for privacy. "It's not much," Matthew said, suddenly self-conscious as he watched Theresa take in his home. But it's dry and warm. It's perfect, Theresa replied honestly. After the oppressive grandeur of Holloway Manor, the humble cabin felt like a sanctuary. Matthew busied himself pouring coffee and setting out a plate of cornbread and preserves. Eat something, he encouraged. Then you can rest. There's fresh water in the basin if you want to wash up. Theresa sat at the table, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice stronger now that she was beginning to feel safe. Matthew paused, considering her question. Mama always said to help those in need. And out here, folks have to look out for each other. It's just the way of things. I can't stay long, Theresa said, picking at the cornbread. My husband, he'll be looking for me. Matthew's expression darkened at the implied threat behind her words. Your husband give you those bruises? Theresa looked down, shame coloring her cheeks. Frederick has expectations of how a wife should behave. I failed to meet them. No man has the right to treat his wife that way, Matthew said firmly. Or any woman, for that matter. They lapsed into silence as Theresa ate, the simple food tasting better than any of the elaborate meals served at Holloway Manor. When she was finished, Matthew showed her to the bed. You sleep, he said. I've got chores to tend to. The door has a strong bolt on the inside if you want to lock it. I'll be outside if you need anything. Exhaustion overtook Theresa as soon as her head hit the pillow. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to truly rest, the sound of Matthew moving about outside a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. When she awoke, the sun was high in the sky. Theresa sat up, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and with them, a renewed sense of dread. Frederick would be awake by now, his rage terrible to behold when he discovered her missing. A knock at the door startled her. Miss? You awake? Matthew's voice called. I've got some stew on if you're hungry. Theresa rose, smoothing her wrinkled dress as best she could. She had bolted the door as Matthew suggested, and now she slid it open to find him standing there with an apologetic smile. Didn't want to wake you, but figured you might be hungry. Thank you, she said, following him to the table where a pot of stew bubbled fragrantly. As they ate, Matthew studied her with a thoughtful expression. You got somewhere to go? Family, maybe. Theresa shook her head. My parents died 2 years ago. I was living with my aunt when I met Frederick. She arranged the marriage. And now you're running from him. It wasn't a question, but Theresa nodded anyway. He'll look for me. He's a powerful man in these parts. What's his name? Maybe I know him. Frederick Holloway. Matthew's spoon clattered against his bowl. Holloway? From Holloway Manor. Theresa nodded, fear returning to her eyes. That's a bad business, Matthew said, his expression grave. Holloway has half the territory in his pocket, including the law. Then you understand why I can't stay? Theresa said softly. I've put you in danger just by being here. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he looked up, determination in his eyes. There's a town called Bodie, over in California. It's a mining town, growing fast. I've got a cousin there who runs a boarding house. If you could get to Bodie, you'd be beyond Holloway's reach. California. The words sounded like a fairy tale to Theresa's ears. That's hundreds of miles away. It is, Matthew agreed. But there's a wagon train leaving from Pine Ridge next week, headed for Sacramento. If you could join up with them. I have no money, Theresa reminded him. And Frederick will be watching the trails. Let me worry about that, Matthew said. For now, you rest and regain your strength. We've got time to figure things out. The next few days fell into a simple routine. Theresa helped around the cabin, washing clothes and preparing meals while Matthew tended to his small herd of cattle. In the evenings, they sat before the fire, talking late into the night. Theresa learned that Matthew had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, seeking a fresh start after losing his brother at Gettysburg. He'd worked as a ranch hand for years before saving enough to buy his own piece of land. It's not much, he said one evening, gesturing to the cabin and the land beyond. But it's mine. No one can take it from me. It's beautiful, Theresa said honestly. The rolling prairie, the distant mountains, the sky that seemed to go on forever, it was a far cry from the confined luxury of Holloway Manor. On the fourth day, as Theresa hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. Her heart leapt into her throat as she watched the approaching riders, 3 of them, moving with purpose. "Matthew," she called, abandoning the laundry and rushing toward the corral where he was mending a fence. "Riders coming." Matthew straightened, shading his eyes against the sun. His expression hardened as he recognized the threat. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice calm but urgent. "Use the bolt." Theresa hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be fine. Go now." She hurried into the cabin, sliding the bolt into place as instructed. Through the small window, she watched as the riders approached, their horses lathered from hard riding. Frederick wasn't among them, but she recognized his foreman, Silas, a brutal man who carried out Frederick's punishments with cold efficiency. Silas reined in before Matthew, who stood with his hands casually at his sides, though Theresa noticed he had positioned himself so his rifle, leaning against the corral fence, was within easy reach. "Afternoon," Matthew greeted them, his voice carrying through the open window. "What brings you fellas out this way?" "Looking for a woman," Silas replied, his voice hard. "Mrs. Holloway. She's run off, and Mr. Holloway is mighty concerned for her safety." "Is that so?" Matthew responded, his tone neutral. "Haven't seen any woman out this way. Pretty isolated, as you can see." Silas's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be sure." "I do mind," Matthew said, his hand drifting closer to his rifle. "This is my property. Unless you've got papers from the sheriff, you'll have to take my word for it." The tension was palpable as the men stared each other down. Theresa held her breath, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure they must hear it even from outside. Finally, Silas spat on the ground. "Mr. Holloway won't be pleased. He's offering a reward for information about his wife's whereabouts. $50. That's so? Well, if I see her, I'll be sure to let him know. For now, I've got work to do." The men lingered a moment longer before wheeling their horses around. As they rode off, Silas called back over his shoulder. "We'll be watching the trails, Dawson. All of them." Only after the riders had disappeared over the horizon did Matthew come to the cabin door. "You can open up now," he called softly. "They're gone." Theresa slid the bolt back with trembling hands. "They know I'm here," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll be back." "Maybe," Matthew conceded. "But they can't prove anything without searching the place, and they can't do that without the sheriff, who's 3 days' ride from here." "What are we going to do?" Theresa asked, sinking into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Matthew knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I meant what I said about Bodie. But we need to get you out of the territory before trying for California. There's another option. My sister lives in Laramie, Wyoming. It's closer, and Holloway's influence doesn't reach that far." "Your sister? Would she help me?" "Maggie's got a good heart. And she never could resist taking in strays." Matthew smiled reassuringly. "We'd need to leave tonight, travel cross-country instead of using the main trails." "We?" Theresa repeated, surprised. "You'd come with me?" "Can't very well send you off alone," Matthew said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Besides, Silas was right about one thing: they'll be watching the trails. But I know this country like the back of my hand. There are ways to Laramie that Holloway's men won't know about." Theresa looked into Matthew's eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity and concern. In the short time she'd known him, he had shown her more kindness than she had experienced in years. The thought of facing the journey without him was terrifying. "What about your home? Your cattle?" she asked. "The cattle can fend for themselves for a spell. As for the cabin," he shrugged, "it'll be here when I get back. Or it won't. Either way, I couldn't live with myself if I let Holloway get his hands on you again." Tears welled in Theresa's eyes. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Matthew's expression softened. "Maybe that's true, but I know enough. I know you're brave and kind. I know you deserve better than what life's handed you so far. And I know that out here, we look out for each other. That's reason enough." As darkness fell, they prepared for the journey. Matthew packed supplies: food, blankets, a small pot for cooking, and ammunition for his rifle. Theresa changed into clothing. He provided men's trousers and a shirt that hung loosely on her smaller frame, but would be more practical for riding than her dress. "My brother's things," Matthew explained when she emerged from behind the curtain. "Been saving them, but I think he'd approve of the cause." They set out under a moonless sky, Matthew leading his horse with Theresa mounted on it. They would travel on foot until they were well away from the cabin, he explained, to minimize their tracks. Buck trotted alongside them, occasionally ranging ahead as if scouting the path. "Won't your dog give us away?" Theresa whispered as they moved through the darkness. "Buck knows to keep quiet when I tell him to," Matthew replied. "Besides, he's got a nose for trouble. Better to have him with us." They traveled through the night, Matthew setting a steady pace, occasionally helping Theresa navigate difficult terrain. As dawn broke, they found themselves in a small copse of trees beside a stream, the perfect place to rest during daylight hours. "We'll move at night," Matthew explained as he spread a blanket for her beneath the sheltering branches of a cottonwood. "Less chance of being spotted that way." "How far is Laramie?" Theresa asked, sinking gratefully onto the blanket. "About 5 days' journey, the way we're going. Maybe longer if we need to be careful." Theresa nodded, fatigue washing over her. As she drifted toward sleep, she was aware of Matthew settling nearby, his rifle across his lap as he kept watch. Their journey fell into a pattern, traveling by night, resting by day, always alert for signs of pursuit. Theresa found herself growing stronger each day, both physically and in spirit. Away from Frederick's domineering presence, she began to remember the person she had been before, curious, determined, even occasionally lighthearted. On the third night, as they sat beside a small, smokeless fire, sharing a meal of rabbit that Matthew had snared, Theresa found herself watching him covertly. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes. He had been nothing but respectful toward her, never presuming, never demanding anything in return for his help. "Tell me about Bodie," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Why there?" Matthew looked up, surprised by the question. "It's a new place," he said after a moment's thought. "A chance to start fresh. The mines are bringing in folks from all over, and in all that coming and going, it's easier to disappear. Plus, my cousin Emily, she's the one with the boarding house. She's good people. She'd help you get settled, find work if you wanted it." "What kind of work could I do?" Theresa asked, genuinely curious. Her education had prepared her to be a wife and hostess, not to earn her own way. "You can read and write, can't you?" Theresa nodded. "Then you could clerk in a store, or maybe teach if the town's growing enough to need another teacher. Or help Emily with the boarding house. Options are wider out west for women willing to work hard." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, a life of her own, making her own decisions, answerable to no one but herself. "I'd like that," she said softly. "A fresh start." Matthew smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. "You'll do fine. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Only because you've helped me," Theresa insisted. "I just provided a blanket and a place to rest," Matthew said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "The strength was always yours." As they prepared to set out again, Theresa impulsively reached out to touch Matthew's arm. "Thank you," she said, putting all the sincerity she could muster into the simple words. "For everything." Matthew covered her hand with his own, the touch sending a surprising warmth through her. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice unusually husky. They continued their journey, the unspoken moment hanging between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge what was growing between them, a connection deeper than gratitude or duty. On the fourth day, disaster struck. They had found shelter in an abandoned hunter's cabin, the roof partially collapsed but the walls still standing. As dusk approached and they prepared to set out again, Buck suddenly growled, his hackles rising. Matthew was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside," he whispered to Theresa, moving to the cabin's single window. Outside, the sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Matthew cursed under his breath. "Holloway's men. Must be a dozen of them. How did they find us?" Theresa asked, fear clutching at her heart. "Doesn't matter now. We need to move." Matthew grabbed their packs, thrust Theresa's into her arms, and led her to the back of the cabin where a small window opened into the woods beyond. "Go through here. Head straight for those rocks on the ridge. I'll be right behind you. But go, Theresa. Now." The urgency in his voice propelled her forward. She squeezed through the window, her heart pounding as she heard voices at the front of the cabin. Moving as quietly as possible, she made for the rocks Matthew had indicated, praying he would follow quickly. Behind her, A shout went up they had found the cabin. Then came the sound that stopped her heart. Gunfire, a rapid exchange of shots. "Matthew!" she cried, forgetting caution in her fear for him. More shots rang out, and then silence. Theresa stood frozen, torn between running to safety and going back to find Matthew. Before she could decide, a figure appeared on the ridge above her, not Matthew, but Silas, Frederick's foreman. "There she is," he shouted, and men appeared on either side of her, closing in. Theresa turned to flee, but there was nowhere to go. As rough hands seized her arms, she looked back toward the cabin, desperate for any sign of Matthew. There was none. "Where is he?" she demanded, struggling against her captors. "What have you done to him?" Silas approached, a cruel smile on his face. "Your cowboy friend? Reckon he's buzzard food by now. Mr. Holloway was quite clear anyone harboring you was to be dealt with permanently." "No," Theresa whispered, grief overwhelming her. "You're lying. See for yourself," Silas said, gesturing toward the cabin where a plume of smoke now rose. They had set it ablaze. Theresa's legs gave out as despair washed over her. Matthew, who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had risked everything to help her, gone, because of her. "Mr. Holloway's waiting," Silas said, hauling her roughly to her feet. "And he's not happy with his runaway bride." They bound her hands and put her on a horse, setting out immediately despite the approaching darkness. Theresa rode in a fog of grief and fear, barely registering the journey back to Holloway Manor. When they arrived, Frederick was waiting on the front steps, his expression a mask of cold fury. "My dear wife," he said as Silas dragged her from the horse. "How good of you to return home." "You murdered him," Theresa said, finding her voice at last. "He did nothing wrong." Frederick's hand shot out, striking her across the face with enough force to knock her to the ground. "He stole what was mine," he snarled. "And so did you, Theresa. Did you really think you could escape me?" He seized her arm, pulling her to her feet and dragging her into the house. Servants scurried out of the way, averting their eyes from the scene. Frederick hauled her up the grand staircase to their bedroom, throwing her inside and locking the door behind them. "You will never leave this house again," he promised, his voice deadly calm. "Not until I decide you've learned your lesson." The days that followed were a nightmare of confinement and fear. Theresa was kept locked in her room, meals brought by a stone-faced maid who never spoke to her. Frederick visited each evening, alternating between rage and cold indifference. The bruises multiplied, but worse was the knowledge that Matthew had died because of her. On the 7th day of her imprisonment, as Theresa sat listlessly by the window watching rain stream down the glass, she noticed a figure moving through the garden below, a man in a wide-brimmed hat, his gait familiar despite the rainy haze. Her heart leapt into her throat. It couldn't be. She had seen the cabin burning, heard Silas's cruel confirmation of Matthew's fate. And yet, the figure disappeared from view, heading toward the back of the house where the kitchen entrance was located. Theresa pressed her face to the glass, straining to see, but he was gone. That night, when Frederick came to her room, Theresa forced herself to greet him with a submissive demeanor. "I've been thinking," she said, keeping her eyes downcast. "Perhaps I could join you for dinner tomorrow? I miss our conversations." Frederick studied her suspiciously, but the prospect of breaking her spirit entirely was too tempting to resist. "Very well. 7 o'clock. Wear the blue dress, it's the only one that hides those unsightly bruises." After he left, Theresa paced the room, her mind racing. If Matthew was truly alive, and she dared not hope too strongly, then she needed to be ready. She gathered what few possessions she truly cared about: her mother's locket, a small book of poetry, the hairpin that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything else she could leave behind without regret. The next evening, dressed in the blue gown as instructed, Theresa was escorted to the dining room by Frederick himself. He was in an unusually good mood, pleased by what he perceived as her surrender. "I've invited the new territorial judge to dine with us next week," he told her as they took their seats at the long table. "It would be best if your indisposition has improved by then." "Of course," Theresa murmured, her eyes on her plate. The meal progressed, course after course of elaborate food that Theresa barely tasted. Her attention was focused on the windows, the doors, searching for any sign of rescue or confirmation that she had imagined the figure in the garden. As the dessert course was being served, a commotion erupted from the kitchen. Shouts, the sound of breaking dishes, and then the dining room doors burst open to reveal Matthew Dawson, very much alive, though sporting a bandage around his head and a determined look in his eyes. Frederick leapt to his feet, reaching for the pistol he kept in his jacket. "How dare you enter my home?" he bellowed. "I'll have you hanged for trespassing." "It's not trespassing when I come with the law," Matthew replied calmly, stepping aside to reveal a man wearing a marshal's badge. Behind him stood several deputies. "Frederick Holloway," the marshal announced, "you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Matthew Dawson, as well as for harboring deserters during the war and defrauding the United States government." Frederick's face drained of color. "What nonsense is this? I demand to see your warrant." "Got it right here," the marshal said, producing a document from his coat. "Seems your foreman Silas was quite talkative once we caught up to him. Told us all about your arrangement with Confederate sympathizers, how you hid them in exchange for a cut of their stolen Union gold." As the deputies moved to restrain Frederick, Matthew crossed to Theresa, who stood frozen in shock. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his eyes searching her face. "You're alive," she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm, needing the physical confirmation. "They told me you were dead." "They tried their best," Matthew said with a grim smile. "Got a bullet across my temple that knocked me senseless, but I was lucky a patrol of federal marshals was passing nearby and heard the gunfire. They scared off Holloway's men before they could finish the job." "But how? What?" Theresa struggled to make sense of it all. "The marshals were already looking for Holloway," Matthew explained. "When I told them what he'd done to you, they agreed to help. Took a few days to gather the evidence and get the warrants, but we got them." Frederick, now in handcuffs, glared at them with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "I have friends in high places. I'll be out within the week, and then you'll both regret this day." The marshal chuckled. "I wouldn't count on that, Holloway. The governor himself signed these warrants. Your friends in high places are scrambling to distance themselves from you as we speak." As Frederick was led away, still shouting threats, Theresa felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small. Matthew took her hands in his. "It is. You're free, Theresa. Free." The word echoed in her mind, beautiful and terrifying all at once. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Matthew said. "The offer of Bodhi still stands. My cousin would welcome you with open arms." Theresa looked up into Matthew's eyes, seeing the warmth there, the unspoken question. "And you?" she asked, her heart racing. "Will you go back to your cabin?" "Eventually," he admitted. "Got to rebuild what Holloway's men destroyed. But first." He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I thought I might accompany you to Bodhi, if you'd like the company." The journey to California was arduous but exhilarating. With Frederick in custody awaiting trial, Theresa was free to travel openly, no longer forced to hide in the shadows. They joined a wagon train in Pine Ridge as Matthew had originally suggested, introducing themselves as brother and sister to avoid scandal, though the knowing looks of the other travelers suggested they weren't entirely convinced. The weeks on the trail transformed Theresa. The physical demands of the journey strengthened her body, while the distance from Holloway Manor allowed her spirit to heal. She found herself laughing more, worrying less, and looking forward with anticipation rather than dread. And through it all, Matthew was there teaching her to build a campfire, to ride properly, to shoot a rifle with reasonable accuracy. He never pushed, never presumed, but Theresa couldn't help noticing the way his eyes followed her, or how his hand lingered when he helped her down from the wagon. For his part, Matthew found himself increasingly drawn to the woman Theresa was becoming confident, resilient, with a quiet strength that had survived Frederick's cruelty. The gratitude she had initially shown him had evolved into something deeper, a connection built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They arrived in Bodhi in late November, the mining town bustling despite the approaching winter. Matthew's cousin Emily welcomed them warmly to her boarding house, a two-story building on the edge of town that catered primarily to respectable single men and the occasional family passing through. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like," Emily told Theresa, showing her to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "And if you're looking for work, The mercantile needs someone who can keep books. Thank you, Theresa said, genuinely touched by the woman's kindness. I'd like that very much. Matthew stayed for 3 days, helping Emily with repairs around the boarding house and introducing Theresa to the town. On the morning of the 4th day, he found her on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the chill as she watched the town come to life. I'll be heading back east tomorrow, he said without preamble, his voice carefully neutral. Need to see about rebuilding before winter sets in fully. Theresa felt her heart constrict, though she had known this moment was coming. Of course, she said, matching his tone. You've already done so much. I can't thank you enough for bringing me here. No need for thanks, Matthew said, leaning against the porch railing beside her. You'll do well here. Emily says Mr. Henderson at the mercantile was impressed with your figures when you spoke to him yesterday. He offered me the position, Theresa confirmed. I start next week. That's good. Real good. They lapsed into silence, both aware of the unspoken words hanging between them. Matthew, Theresa began, just as he said, Theresa, they both laughed, the tension breaking slightly. Ladies first, Matthew said with a smile. Theresa gathered her courage. I was wondering. That is, I hope you're right. To let me know how the rebuilding goes. Matthew's expression softened. I'd like that. And maybe, come spring, when the trails are clear. I'd like that too, Theresa said, her heart lightening. Very much. The first letter arrived in January, carried by a mail coach that had braved the mountain passes. Theresa recognized Matthew's handwriting immediately, the careful, even script that belied his limited formal education. Dear Theresa, I hope this finds you well and settling into life in Bodie. The cabin is coming along, though it's slow work in the cold. Buck sends his regards. He's taken to sleeping by the fire and stealing my blankets when I'm not looking. Frederick Holloway's trial has been set for March. The marshal says they have enough evidence to convict him 10 times over, especially with Silas turning state's witness. You won't need to testify, which I know will come as a relief. I find myself thinking of you often, wondering if Bodie is all you hoped it would be. I remember your smile that last morning, how it lit up your eyes, and I carry that memory with me through these cold days. Until spring, Matthew. Theresa read the letter a dozen times, her fingers tracing his words, especially the part about her smile. She sat down immediately to compose a reply, filling pages with descriptions of Bodie, her work at the mercantile, and the friends she was making at the boarding house. She hesitated over the closing, pen hovering above the paper. Finally, she wrote, I think of you too, Matthew. The cabin won't be home until you're in it. Yours, Theresa. The exchange of letters continued through the winter months, each one more open than the last. Theresa described her growing confidence, her delight in earning her own wages, her plans to perhaps open a small shop of her own someday. Matthew wrote of the cabin's progress, of neighboring homesteaders who helped with the rebuilding, of his hopes to expand his herd come summer. And woven through it all, growing stronger with each letter, was the undeniable connection between them, no longer just gratitude or protectiveness, but something deeper, more enduring. In April, as the mountain passes cleared and travel became easier, Theresa received a letter unlike the others. It was shorter, more direct. Dear Theresa, the cabin is finished. The herd is thriving. The only thing missing is you, if you still want what I want. I'll be on the next stage to Bodie unless you write to tell me otherwise. All my heart, Matthew. Theresa didn't write to stop him. Instead, she waited at the stage depot every day for a week, scanning each arrival for Matthew's familiar figure. When he finally stepped down from the dusty coach, looking travel-worn but determined, she didn't hesitate. She ran straight into his arms. I missed you, she said simply, looking up into his face, noting the new lines around his eyes, the way the winter sun had darkened his skin. I missed you too, he replied, his arms tightening around her. More than I have words for. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, oblivious to the curious glances of passers-by. Emily greeted Matthew with a warm hug and knowing smile before tactfully excusing herself to attend to other guests. Alone in the small parlor, Matthew took Theresa's hands in his. I've been thinking, he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. About what happens next. And what did you decide? Theresa asked, her heart racing. that I'd like to court you proper, if you're willing. No rushing, no pressure. Just getting to know each other in the normal way of things. Theresa smiled, touched by his consideration. After Frederick's heavy-handed pursuit and domineering ways, Matthew's gentle approach was a balm to her soul. I'd like that very much. Their courtship unfolded over the next 2 months, a sweet, unhurried exploration of their feelings for each other. They took walks through Bodie, shared meals at the town's small restaurant, attended church together on Sundays. Matthew found work at one of the local ranches, earning enough to extend his stay indefinitely. In June, on a warm evening as they sat on a hillside overlooking the town, Matthew finally asked the question that had been on his mind since winter. "Theresa," he said, taking her hand in his, "I know we've only known each other a short while, all told. But in that time, I've come to care for you more than I thought possible. You're the strongest, kindest woman I've ever met. And if you do me the honor of becoming my wife, I promise to spend every day trying to deserve you." Tears sprang to Theresa's eyes, not tears of fear or sadness as she had shed so often with Frederick, but tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Yes, Matthew." They were married in July, a simple ceremony in Bodie's small church with Emily as Theresa's attendant and the ranch foreman standing up for Matthew. The entire town turned out to celebrate, everyone having heard the story of how they met embellished somewhat in the telling, with Matthew's role growing more heroic with each retelling. After the celebration, they set out for Matthew's homestead, making the journey in easy stages, savoring their time together. When they finally crested the ridge that overlooked the cabin, Theresa gasped in delight. The rebuilt structure was larger than before, with a proper porch, glass windows, and a garden plot already sprouting with vegetables. "Welcome home," Matthew said, helping her down from the wagon. Buck bounded out to greet them, nearly knocking Theresa over in his enthusiasm. Laughing, she knelt to ruffle his fur, feeling a sense of rightness wash over her. This was where she belonged. As summer turned to fall, Theresa and Matthew settled into the rhythms of life together. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to preserve vegetables for winter, to manage a household with limited resources. He taught her to ride properly, to help with the cattle, to shoot a rifle with accuracy. And in the evenings, they sat before the fire, talking of the future, perhaps children someday, an expansion of the herd, maybe even a bigger garden come spring. In October, exactly 1 year after Theresa had fled Holloway Manor, they received word that Frederick Holloway had been convicted of multiple counts of fraud and attempted murder. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, his empire dismantled, his name disgraced. "Are you relieved?" Matthew asked as they read the letter from the marshal together. Theresa considered the question. "I am," she said slowly. "Not for revenge, but because he can't hurt anyone else now." Matthew nodded, understanding. "You're a remarkable woman, Theresa Dawson." The name still gave her a thrill. Theresa Dawson, not Holloway. A name she had chosen freely, a life she had built for herself with a man who respected her, valued her, loved her for herself. Winter came again, but this time Theresa faced it without fear. The cabin was snug, the pantry well-stocked, and most importantly, she was with Matthew. On cold nights, they huddled beneath quilts before the fire, planning for the spring, sharing dreams, building a life together day by day. And when spring finally arrived, bringing with it new calves for the herd and tender shoots in the garden, Theresa had news of her own. "Matthew," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I went to see the doctor when I was in town yesterday." Matthew turned to her, instantly concerned. "Are you ill?" "No," Theresa said, a smile spreading across her face. "I'm with child. We're going to have a baby come fall." The joy that lit Matthew's face was everything she had hoped for. He gathered her in his arms, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "A baby," he whispered, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." As the months passed, and Theresa's body changed with the growing child within her, their happiness only deepened. Matthew was attentive and protective, but never stifling, always mindful of the fine line between care and control. In September, with the first chill of autumn in the air, their son was born, Thomas Matthew Dawson, a healthy, sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin. As Theresa held him in her arms, Matthew sitting beside her on the bed, she felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle. From fear to love, she murmured, stroking the baby's downy head. What a journey it's been. Matthew leaned in to kiss her, his expression tender. And it's only just beginning, he promised. 5 years later, the Dawson homestead had grown considerably. A second child, a daughter named Eliza after Theresa's mother, had joined the family, and the original cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing household. The herd had tripled in size, and they had hired 2 hands to help with the workload. On a warm summer evening, as the children played in the yard under Buck's watchful eye, the dog, now gray-muzzled, but still devoted, Theresa, and Matthew sat on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Matthew asked, his voice contemplative. "When you came stumbling down to that creek, half dead with exhaustion?" "Often," Theresa admitted. "I was so afraid. Of Frederick, of the future, of everything really. And now—" Theresa looked out at their land, at their children, at the life they had built together. "Now I'm not afraid of anything," she said with quiet confidence. "Because even if hard times come, and they will, that's life, I know we'll face them together." Matthew tightened his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Together," he agreed. "Always." As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the prairie in gold and amber, Theresa thought about how far she had come from that terrified young woman who had fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. That night, a simple act of kindness, a blanket, and a place to rest had changed the course of her life. And in that change, she had found not just safety, but love, purpose, and a home that was truly her own. "I love you, Matthew Dawson," she said, turning to look into the eyes that had first regarded her with such compassion by that creek 5 years ago. "And I love you, Theresa Dawson," he replied, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day. "With all my heart." In the gathering dusk, their children's laughter rang out across the prairie, the sweetest sound either of them had ever heard. The promise of a future built on love instead of fear, on freedom instead of captivity, on the simple, profound truth that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to accept the hand extended in kindness and begin again.